been in a study of David, if you remember, more written about him than anyone else. And we're on part 15, going through a man after God's own heart. Obviously, he wrote over almost half of the Psalms, as well as so much of the Scripture talks about it. We started in Acts 13, you remember, a man after God's own heart. And if you remember, we looked at what does it mean to be, what's God looking for, if you remember. We looked at a lot of seeing as God sees. There's another study that we did. We had a friend who sticks closer than a brother with Jonathan. God removed all his crutches. We looked at that. Waiting on God, working for God, trusting God, all these different things we looked at in David's life. If you remember last week, we looked at about when God says no. When he wanted to build the temple and God said no. And the reason I mentioned that is because, that was kind of like, since John and Martha and Paul and Velma are here, remember, I wanted to do teaching college. And so, if you remember, I talked with my Uncle John, and he recommended I go to the master's program, and I went to Iowa for the interview, but God said no. And it's important to recognize when God says no, you have to accept it. And so this meant a lot to me, and then both of their wives are really in Proverbs 31 women. I think it's neat. They both got good wives, and it's been having to look all my life looking and seeing it. So it's neat to see that they both found good ones and both are good men. So, but I was there last week. Basically, we looked at what God says. No, it's never easy. But actually, because he said no, God also made him some promises. In 2 Samuel 7, he talks about he's going to make him a great nation, and so on. If you saw it in just a little bit about it, if you remember, he didn't want him to build the temple because he was a man of war. And so he had a lull during the time in chapter 7. When you get to chapter 8, he then is expanding in the kingdom. And you had 4 different, this is in 2 Samuel, he had different, he went back to, there was more battles to fight. He defeated the Philistines, Moab, he did the Syria, and he did Edom. And so God is, living up to his promise in chapter 7, he made a promise to him. And he's now doing this, and he's expanding north, south, east, and west the kingdom. And so as he was doing that, he now is, when you get to chapter 9, he's now in peace. Also what happens when you look at the background, at the end of chapter 8, if you look at it, he now has his administration that he sets up. If you remember one of our studies of Psalms 101, in which David, before he had a kingdom, said the type of person, his personal manifesto, and then his manifesto for his kingdom. Who does he want to surround himself with, and what type of people does he want around him? This is now fulfillment in verse 15 to 18, the type of men that he wanted around him. And it's a fulfillment of Psalms 101. And so I think it's interesting who we surround ourselves with have a tremendous impact on our life. So that takes us today, and think a little bit about it. Don Eaton and Herb Fennell have both gone on to be with the Lord. But one quality that they each had is if they gave you their word, what did it mean? They were going to do it, no matter what. No matter what it cost them. If they gave you their word, they were going to do something. Even if it is at a personal loss, they were going to do it. Well, today we're going to see that David was a man of his word. So I think it's important to recognize one of the greatest things that can ever be said of you is that you're a man of your word. And so let's look at it and think a little bit about it. You have it in chapter 9 that you have it. For the background is in 1 Samuel 20. So look over in 1 Samuel, then we'll go to 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel 20, the background, and if you stop and think about this, how many years earlier this actually took place. 1 Samuel 20, you remember when Jonathan and David are together, and David believes that Saul is trying to kill him, and Jonathan doesn't. And this is when Jonathan comes to the realization that, yes, his dad is trying to kill him. So in chapter 20, if you notice what happens starting in verse 14, Jonathan's speaking to him. And he says, if I'm still alive, this is 1 Samuel 20, verse 14, if I'm still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth, which is what took place, you remember, in the previous chapter of chapter 8 of Samuel. 2 Samuel. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, May the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. And Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. So notice they make a covenant, and that when Jonathan recognizes that David, yes, I'm the heir apparent, because I am Saul's son, but you're going to be king. And when you do, I don't want you to do like everybody else does. You stop and you think, how many of you know much about lions? There's always a battle of who's going to be the top lion, male. And when it's decided, what is the male lion? What's his first act that he does? He kills all the offspring of the previous lions. Only his offspring. So no matter what the lionesses are saying, he kills every one of the younger lions off. Only his offspring is going to make it. So obviously then the next, it goes on for a while in the pride, and then the next male comes along and does the same thing over time. Well, notice then he's saying to do this. Well, notice if you think about it, it took David 7.5 years to get control, and he had to control the southern 2 tribes to get control of the northern 10 where they joined with him. If as long as you have a Saul descendant, you think the Saul's descendant, there's always a split, which happens again. You remember with just after Solomon with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, they had the split again. So you think about what he's asking him. As long as there's a descendant alive of Saul, they are going to want to have their own king. So think about what he's asking him to do. Notice then it was based on hesed. You notice it said loving kindness, a Hebrew word hesed, used over 250 times in the Old Testament. And it has to do with the loyal, steadfast love. The 2 things you have there, notice the 2 things, loyalty and love. Because of Jonathan's love for David and David's love for Jonathan. So you had this many years later, you think about it, you had all the years of running from Saul, 7.5 years then to gain control of the tribe. All the fighting that took place before he finally has control of everything. And now he goes back to the covenant. God kept his part of the covenant. And notice David wants to think about what did he say to Jonathan this many years later. How many of us have ever made a statement to somebody? How many of us keep that word? It doesn't matter how many years later, God can bring it to your mind. Oh, I made a promise. Are we going to keep it? I'll never forget when I was in Alabama, we needed a car. Worked with a guy, and he had a Toyota Celica. And that was back, if you remember, when the gas prices skyrocketed. He bought the car, and he put hundreds and hundreds of, every time something would go, the clutch went out, the engine, we rebuilt it, everything was going out. He put so much in it, he finally decided, I've had enough. I am not putting another dime in this car. I'm going to sell it. We needed a car. It was way below what he put in it, but he said, I'll sell it to you for $550. It had 78,000 miles on it. I said, well, I don't have $550. All I have is $500. I'll give you $500, and if it's as good as we think it's going to be, I'll give you the other $50 when I get it. We put 75,000 miles on it. We sold it for $500. Gene's brother drove it forever, and he sold it for the same. Well, then the Lord, I was in Oklahoma by this time. This guy was married. He was in Birmingham. Brought to my attention. Did you make a promise to him? You owe him what? You owe him $50. So I had to try to find out where he lived and so on, and I wrote a check and sent it to him. Because I gave him what? And was it as good a car as we thought it was going to be? So you owe it to him. Same thing happens here. So notice then what he goes and he does now. So by the way, the same thing happens in 24. Saul recognizes David's going to be king in 1 Samuel 24. And Saul, of all things, asked David, don't wipe out my offspring. When you think of what Saul was doing to David, I mean, chasing him around, causing so many problems, and he's then saying, okay, you're going to become king, but don't wipe out my people. I've been trying to wipe you out all this time, but don't wipe mine out. And he gave the promise to him as well. So think about it, it's the binding one. So notice then, how many of us have given our word, and are we keeping it? Let's look at it then. Notice, if you think about it, some background. Jonathan had one son, according to 1 Chronicles chapter 8, 1 Chronicles 9. And what was his son's name? That's not his actual name. What is his actual name? His actual name is Mirabal. When in 2 Samuel, When Saul and Jonathan die in battle, remember the nurse picks him up and is running because they believe what's going to happen. A new kingdom's going to come in, and what are they going to do to all the offspring? Just like with the lion, he's going to come in and he's going to do what? He's going to kill them all. She dropped him, and remember, he became lame in both feet. That's when his name changed, because they didn't think he was worthy of anything. And from then on, it's what he was called. Look at Scripture, you'll see it. 1 Chronicles 8, 1 Chronicles 9. That's not his real name. But he only had one son. So let's look at it, and that gives you the background of what's taking place. He's in, notice the chaos that takes place. Now he's in complete control. So now he wants to honor this covenant that he made that many years earlier. So you see it in chapter 9, starting in verse 1 of 2 Samuel. But David said, "Is there yet anyone left in the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" I think it's interesting what he says. Most of us would make this statement: is there anyone worthy? Or is there anyone capable? Anybody really deserving of me doing this? Notice he says, is there anyone? Anyone whatsoever that's left alive. You'll notice then, he goes in verse 2, kind of looking for this. Now there was a servant in the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. They called him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" He said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness of God?" The word there, hesed, both times. And Ziba said to the king, interesting, look what he says. "There is a son of Jonathan." Then what does he say? "Who is crippled in both feet." Why do you have to say that? Why do you say he's crippled? Does that make any difference? His question was, is there anyone of Saul? Now it could be the fact he's saying he's crippled. In other words, he's no threat to you. He's not going to take over, try to the kingdom. Or is he saying, he's not worthy of showing kindness, he's crippled, he's really of no use to society? You think about it. David wants to know, is there anyone? And now he's told who he is. Now, could David stop right there? Is he going to be an asset, or is he going to be a liability? What can he do for you? There's nothing that he can do for David, but David gave his word, didn't he? Could he cause him problems, which he does in 2 Samuel chapter 19. But notice then what he does then. So he goes and he searches for him. So he has the request. Notice the rescue. So the king said, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodibar." Now, what is Lodibar? Two words put together, meaning what? No pasture. So where did he go? He went to the most desolate place around. He crossed the Jordan, it's east of the Jordan, trying to get away from Jerusalem. It's also to the north and then to the east. He went to the most desolate place she could find, to try to keep him from being found, or nobody would go looking for him. Now, can you imagine if you are Mephibosheth and all of a sudden here comes the king's men 20-some years later? How are you going to feel about it right now when you see them? Scared? Because you're now being hauled back to Jerusalem? What do you think is going to happen when you get there? I've been found and it's over with. So think about it. Here you have it. So notice then what takes place then. The restoration is not going to take place. They find him. And notice in verse 6, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, fell on his face and prostrated him and said to David, "Here is your servant." Basically, he's fallen down and he's just basically, I'm worthless. You also notice he says, "I'm nothing but a dead dog." So what kind of self-esteem do you think he had? All his life. Notice from the point of his falling, he was never called by his real name again. His whole life he has been called by his name. How would you like to have how many of you ever had nicknames growing up? And how many of you how many of you tell people your nickname today? Or you don't want anybody to know the nickname you were called because you don't want to be called it again. Notice then what's taking place. Here it is. you think about it, I'm nobody. Notice what he says in verse 7 and what David says to him. David said, do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you may eat at my table regularly. So he's going from no pasture, desolate place, to where he's going to go. All the things that his grandfather had, his estate, is being given back to him. But notice then, it's more than just that. Notice in 9. Then the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belongs to Saul and all of his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him. You shall bring in the produce so that you, my master's grandson, may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. He can he take care of it? But Ziba and his family can. So they're taking care of it for who? For Jonathan's son, right? They're doing all this. But notice what's interesting. Notice in 11 then, and Ziba said to the king, according to all my lord the king commands, his servant, so his servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Now can you imagine, all of a sudden, here comes Absalom, here comes Amon, and then who else comes in on these crutches, hobbling in? And he sits at the table, right along with him. Is that not a picture, by the way, of what Christ has done for you and I? Did he deserve it? Nope. It's called grace, isn't it? Unmerited favor. Here you have David is extending grace to him because of a promise he made to his father that many years before. And you stop and you think about it, and it's a great picture, like I said, of God's grace. What do you think what do you think Absalom or what do you think Amon might be thinking? They look across the table and do they see Saul's grandson? Is that a possibility of him taking the kingdom instead of me getting it? You think about all the things that take place, but that's what Dad said, that's what David said, and that's what's going to take place. How many of you know much about our history? Thomas Jefferson, I've always loved studying history, but he was out on a cross-country ride one day, riding horses with friends, companions, and they came to a river that was swelled, it was flooding. And there was a person who wanted to get across the river. So his companions started going across. Several of them went across. And then when Jefferson went to go across, the person asked if he could ride with him. Jefferson reached down, pulled him up on the horse, and they went across together. When they get to the other side, the companions asked the man, "Why did you ask the president for a ride?" He said, "I didn't know he was the president." "Why'd you ask him for a ride?" And direct quote, "He had a yes face, and the ones before had a no face." How many of us have a yes face, and how many of us have a no face? An interesting question. It's amazing how many times you can see it when people recognize when you have it. Give you an example. I was at the refinery spent a number of years ago, and Sunoco owned it. And I had a boss who was in Toledo. Every 2 weeks, the jet plane would come from Philadelphia with the executive, stop in Toledo and pick him up. A couple others, they'd fly to Tulsa. And so the boss would want to meet with my coworker and I to go over what we were doing and kind of give us direction. Well, the refinery furnished lunch for the bigwigs. And Eric, the boss, said, "Why don't you have lunch? There's plenty of food. We'll go at the end of the line. We'll go through and we'll sit off at our own table and we'll discuss what's going on." We went through a couple of times and I said, "Eric, they don't like Matt and I here." "Why?" They had a no face on, right? I mean, it was obvious. You little peon over here. What are you doing over here having lunch? Even though there's plenty of food. He said, Eric said, no, that's no problem. 2 weeks later, when he comes to fly back in, what do you think happened? called Matt and I on the phone and said, hey, I need to meet with you, but I'm sorry, it'll have to be after lunch because I was informed that you guys are no longer welcome to have lunch. Why? How did I know? Because they had a no face on. They didn't have to say anything. How many of us have no faces on when people see us? Did David have a no face on, or did he have a yes face? And I think part of it has to do with the fact that you stop and think about it, how can I show grace to somebody? And so often we think they have to earn it. Let me give you some ways that you and I can show grace, because otherwise we simply have a story, don't we? We simply have a story. Let me give you a couple of passages we'll look at. In the New Testament, I'll give you three of them and think about how we can do it. Look over in Ephesians chapter 4. We know it well. Ephesians 4, starting in 29 down to 32. Remember in 29 it says, let no unwholesome word proceed out of your mouth, but what? But only a word that brings edification, right? Edification meaning what? Building up? According to the need of the moment, that it may give, what's the word? Grace. Unmerited favor. They don't deserve that nice word. They don't deserve me not saying the other things that aren't too nice that's true about it. How many times are we saying what's graceful to the person or not saying something because of grace? Our speech makes so much difference. What do the people say? He's crippled, he is no use. He's Jonathan's son, he has use. How do we respond? He goes on in there and notice it says, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as Christ forgave us. How many of us in our attitudes are doing that? Another one that I think that I've often thought a lot about is in Colossians chapter 4. We can do it through our speech, we can do it through our actions. What about in Colossians 4? If you remember in verse 4, Paul is in prison. He says, he prays, says, please pray for me that I may know how to speak as I ought to speak. And when he gets to verse 5, you remember he says, conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. But then it's the key verse for what I'm referring to. Notice in 6, let your speech always be with grace. Always. Unmerited favor. Believe me, that is hard to do. But notice not only with grace, but seasoned with what? Salt. What was salt used for in that time frame? They didn't have refrigeration, did they? So it can be that of purifying. It's going to also be that of flavoring. It's also going to be that of penetrating. All of this is our speech preserving. They don't deserve it. That's not the issue. Can you think about it? Mephibosheth, did he get what he deserved? According to their society. What do you and I deserve? The wages of sin is death. I'm thankful for mercy, because with mercy means he didn't send me to hell, but by grace he's allowing me to go to heaven. I certainly don't deserve it. Think about it. How can I give grace to somebody else? You say they don't deserve it. Okay, granted they don't. Let me give you a third passage just to really think about it. Read it last night. Hadn't really thought much about it. Look over in Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 28. Therefore, since this is Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, since we received a kingdom which cannot be shaken, notice what he says, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. Why should I do it? Because out of gratitude for what he's done for me. They don't deserve it, but neither do I. And because he showed me grace, I will extend grace to somebody else. Why did they call them little Christians in the book of Acts? Because they're little Christ. You and I are supposed to be little Christ today where we're at. God showed us grace. David showed grace. We can do the same. So let's think about how we can apply today. When, where, and how can I make right on a promise? It doesn't matter if you wished you hadn't made it. It's one thing I really don't like what our country does and has done for years. We make treaties, but then how many times do we break them whenever it doesn't fit what we want? If we don't want to keep them, we shouldn't be making them. But as a person, if you and I make a promise to somebody, we must keep it. We must. Otherwise, how do they know what to believe and what not to? Second of all, who and how can I show grace to this week? How many of you ever got up every morning, God, how can I show grace to today? Or how can I show it? Do you think if we had that prayer every single day, do you think it would come across? What about the guy when you're on 169 and he cuts you off? He doesn't deserve being let in. He's driving like an idiot. I'm not going to do it. Right? You're going to find out on every road you drive here in Oklahoma, I think. But who, think about it. How can I show it? Do you have a yes face? It's an interesting deal. How do you get one? I think the way you get it is think about what he's done for you. And out of gratitude for what he's done for you, you then can show it to somebody else. We go often, so often. That's why it's always amazing to me that Paul, what did he say? I am chief among what? He wrote that after he wrote how much of the New Testament? He never forgot who he was. You and I need to never forget what Christ has done for us. Christ has done for us. Christ has done for us. Christ has done for us.